Next chapter, Francesca. Deep autumn was birthday time for Francesca, and cold rain swept against her frame house in the south Iowa countryside. She watched the rain, looked through it toward the hills along Middle River, thinking of Richard. He had died on a day like this, 8 years ago, from something with a name she would rather not remember. But Francesca thought of him now, and his sturdy kindness, his steady ways, and the even life he had given her. The children had called neither of them. The children had called. You know what? It's kind of dark in here. I can't see the punctuation. There we go. The children had called. Neither of them could make it home again this year for her birthday, though it was her 67th. She understood, as she always did, always had, always would. They were both in mid-career, running hard, managing a hospital, teaching students, Michael getting into a second marriage, Carolyn struggling with her first. Secretly, she was glad they never seemed to arrange a visit on her birthday. She had her own ceremonies reserved for that day. This morning, her friends from Winterset had stopped by with a birthday cake. Francesca made coffee while she... Francesca made coffee while the talk ran to grandchildren in the town, to Thanksgiving, and what to get for Christmas for whom. The quiet laughter and the rise and fall of conversation from the living room were comforting in their familiarity, and reminded Francesca of one small reason why she had stayed here after Richard's death. Michael had touted Florida, Carolyn New England, that she had remained in the hills of South Iowa, on the land, keeping her old address for a special reason, and she was glad she had done that. Francesca had watched them leave at lunchtime. They drove their Buicks and Fords down the lane, turned onto the paved county road, and headed toward Winterset, wiper blades pushing aside the rain. They were good friends, though they would never understand what lay inside of her, would not understand even if she told them. Her husband had said she would find good friends when he brought her here from after the war from Naples. He said, Iowans have their faults, but one of them is not lack of caring. And that was true. It's true. She had been 25 when they met, out of the university for 3 years, teaching at a private school for girls, wondering about her life. Most of the young Italian men were dead or injured or in POW camps, or broken by the fighting. Her affair with Niccolo, a professor of art at the university, who painted all day and took her on wild, reckless tours of the underside of Naples at night, had been over for a year, done in finally by the unceasing disapproval of her traditional parents. She wore ribbons in her black hair and clung to her dreams, but no handsome sailors disembarked looking for her. No voices came up to her window from the street below. The hard press of reality brought her to the recognition that her choices were constrained. Richard offered a reasonable alternative, kindness and the sweet promise of America. She had studied him in a soldier's uniform as they sat in a cafe in the Mediterranean sunlight, saw him looking earnestly at her in his Midwestern way, and came to Iowa with him. Came to have his children, to watch Michael play football on cold October nights, to take Carolyn to Des Moines for her prom dresses. She exchanged letters with her sister in Naples several times each year, and returned there twice, when each of her parents had died. But Madison County was home. But Madison County was home now, and she had no longing to go back again. The rain stopped in mid-afternoon, and then resumed its ways just before evening. In the twilight, Francesca poured a small glass of brandy and opened the bottom drawer of Richard's roll-top desk. The walnut piece she had passed down through 3 generations of his family. That had passed down through 3 generations of his family. She took out a manila envelope and brushed her hand across it slowly, as she did each year on this day. The postmark read, Seattle, Washington, September 12, 65. She always looked at her postmarks first. That was part of the ritual. And then to the address written in longhand. Francesca Johnson, Rural Route 2, Winterset, Iowa. Next, the return address, carelessly scrabbled in the upper left. Box 642, Bellingham, Washington. She sat in a chair by the window, looked at the addresses, and concentrated, for it contained in them was the movement of his hands, and she wanted to bring back the feel of those hands on her 22 years ago. When she could feel his hands touching her, she opened the envelope, carefully removed 3 letters, a short manuscript, 2 photographs, and a complete issue of National Geographic, along with clippings from other issues of the magazine. There, in great light fading, she sipped her brandy, looking over the rim of her glass to the handwritten note clipped on the tight manuscript pages. The letter was on his stationery, simple stationery that said only Robert Kincaid, writer-photographer, at the top in discreet lettering. September 10, 1965. Dear Francesca, enclosed are 2 photographs. One is a shot I took of you in the pasture at sunrise. I hope you like it as much as I do. The other is of Rosamond Bridge before I removed your note tacked to it. I sit here trolling the gray areas of my mind for every detail, every moment of our time together. I ask myself over and over, what happened to me in Madison County, Iowa? And I struggle to bring it together. That's why I wrote this little piece, Falling from Dimension Z. I have enclosed as a way of trying to sift through my confusion. I look down the barrel of a lens, and you're at the end of it. I begin working on an article, and I'm writing about you. I'm not even sure how I got back here from Iowa. Somehow, the old truck brought me home, yet I barely remember the miles going by. A few weeks ago, I felt self-contained, reasonably content. Maybe not profoundly happy, maybe a little lonely, but at least content. All of that has changed. It's clear to me now that I have been moving toward you and you toward me for a long time. Though neither of us was aware of the other before we met, there was a kind of mindless certainty humming blithely along beneath our ignorance that ensured we would come together, like 2 solitary birds flying the great prairies by celestial reckoning. All of these years and lifetimes we have been moving toward one another. The road is a strange place. Shuffling along, I looked up, and you were there, walking across the grass toward my truck on an August day. In retrospect, it seems inevitable. It could not have been any other way, a case of what I call the high probability of the improbable. So here I am, walking around with another person inside of me. Though I think I put it better the day we parted, when I said there is a 3rd person we have created from the 2 of us, and I am stalked now by that other entity. Somehow we must see each other again. Any place, any time. Call me if ever you need anything, or simply want to see me. I'll be there pronto. Let me know if you can come out here sometime, anytime. I can arrange plane fare, if that's a problem. I'm off to Southeast India next week, but I'll be back in late October. I love you, Robert. P.S. The photo project in Madison County turned out fine. Look for it in NG next year. Or tell me if you want me to send a copy of the issue when it's published. Francesca Johnson set her brandy glass on the white oak windowsill and stared at an 8x10 black and white photograph of herself. Sometimes it was hard for her to remember how she had looked then, 22 years ago, in tight faded jeans, sandals, and a white t-shirt, her hair blowing in the morning wind as she leaned against a fence post. Through the rain, from her place by the window, she could see the post where the old fence still circumscribed the pasture. When she rented out that land, after Richard died, she stipulated the pasture must be kept intact, left untouched, even though it was empty now and had turned to meadow grass. The first serious lines were just beginning to show on her face in the photograph. His camera had found them. Still, she was pleased with what she saw. Her hair was black, and her body was full and warm, filling out the jeans just about right. Yet it was her face at which she stared. It was the face of a woman desperately in love with a man taking the picture. She could see him clearly also, down the flow of her memory. Each year she ran all the images through her mind, meticulously, remembering everything, forgetting nothing, imprinting all of it. forever like tribesmen passing down an oral history through the generations. He was tall and thin and hard, and moved like the grass itself, without effort, gracefully. His silver-gray hair hung well below his ears, and nearly always looked disheveled, as if he had just come in from a long sea voyage through a stiff wind, and had tried to brush it into place with his hands. His narrow face, high cheekbones, and hair falling over his forehead set off light blue eyes that seemed never to stop looking for the next photograph. He had smiled at her, saying how fine and warm she looked in early life, asked her to lean against the post, and then moved around her in a wide arc, shooting from knee level, then standing, and then lying on his back with the camera pointed up at her. She had been slightly embarrassed at the amount of film he used, but pleased by the amount of attention that he paid to her. She hoped none of the neighbors were out early on their tractors, though on that particular morning she hadn't cared too much about neighbors and what they thought. He shot, loaded film, changed lenses, changed cameras, shot some more, and talked quietly to her as he worked, always telling her how good she looked to him, and how much he loved her. "Francesca, you're incredibly beautiful." Sometimes he stopped and just stared at her, through her, around her, inside of her. Her nipples were clearly outlined where they were pressed against the cotton t-shirt. She had been strangely unconcerned about that, about being naked underneath that shirt. More, she was glad of it, and was warm knowing that he could see her breasts so clearly down his lens. Never would she have dressed this way around Richard. He would not have approved. Indeed, before meeting Robert Kincaid, she would not have dressed this way any time. Robert had asked her to arch her back ever so slightly, and he had whispered then, "Yes, yes, that's it, stay there." That was when he had taken the photograph at which she now stared. The light was perfect. That's what he had said. Cloudy Bright was his name for it, and the shutter clicked steadily as he moved around her. He was lithe. That was the word she had thought of while watching him. At 52, his body was all lean muscle that moved with the kind of intensity and power that comes only to men who work hard and take care of themselves. He told her he had been a combat photographer in the Pacific, and Francesca could imagine him coming up smoke-drenched beaches with the Marines, cameras banging against him, one to his eye, the shutter almost on fire with the speed of his picture-taking. She looked at the picture again, studied it. I did look good, she thought, smiling to herself at the mild self-admiration. I never looked that good before or after it was him. I never looked that good before or after it was him. And she took another sip of brandy, while the rain climbed up and milled hard on the back of November wind. Robert Kincaid was a magician of sorts, who lived within himself in strange, almost threatening places. Francesca had sensed as much immediately on a hot, dry Monday in August 1965, when he stepped out of his truck onto her driveway. Richard and the children were at the Illinois State Fair, exhibiting the prize steer that received more attention than she did, and she had the week to herself. God, do I know that feeling. She had been sitting on the front porch swing, drinking iced tea, casually watching the dust spiral up from under a pickup coming down the country road. The truck was moving slowly, as if the driver were looking for something. Stopped just short of her lane, and then turned up toward the house. Oh God, she had thought, who's this? She was barefoot, wearing jeans and a faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, shirt tail out. Her long black hair was fastened up by a tortoiseshell comb her father had given her when she left the old country. The truck rolled up the lane and stopped near the gate to the wire fence surrounding the house. Francesca stepped off the porch and walked unhurriedly through the grass toward the gate, and out of the pickup came Robert Kincaid, looking like some vision from a never-written book called An Illustrated History of Shamans. His tan military-style shirt was tacked down to his back with perspiration. There were wide, dark circles of it under his arms. The top 3 buttons were undone, and she could see tight chest muscles just below the plain silver chain around his neck. Over his shoulders were wide orange suspenders, the kind worn by people who spent a lot of time in wilderness areas. He smiled. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for a covered bridge out this way, and I can't find it. I think I am temporarily lost. He wiped his forehead with a blue bandana and smiled again. His eyes looked directly at her, and she felt something jump inside. The eyes, the voice, the face, the silver hair, the easy way he moved his body. Old ways, disturbing ways, ways that draw you in, ways that whisper to you in the final moment before sleep comes, when the barriers have fallen, ways that rearrange the molecular space between male and female, regardless of species. The generations must roll, and the ways whisper only of that single requirement, nothing more. The power is infinite, the design supremely elegant. The ways are unswerving, their goal is clear, the ways are simple. We have made them seem complicated. Francesca sensed this without knowing she was sensing it, sensed it at the level of herself, and there began the thing that would change her forever. A car went past on the road, trailing dust behind it, and honked. Francesca waved back at Floyd Clark's brown arm sticking out of his Chevy and turned back to the stranger. "You're pretty close. The bridge is only about 2 miles from here." And then, after 20 years of living a closed life, a life of a circumscribed behavior and hidden feelings demanded by a rural culture, Francesca Johnson surprised herself by saying, "I'll be glad to show it to you if you want." Why she did that, she never had been sure. A young girl's feelings rising like a bubble through water and bursting out. Maybe after all these years. She was not shy, but not forward either. The only thing she could ever conclude was that Robert Kincaid had drawn her in somehow, after only a few seconds of looking at him. He was obviously taken aback, slightly by her offer, but he recovered quickly with a serious look on his face and said he'd appreciate that. And from the back steps she picked up the cowboy boots she wore for farm chores and walked out to his truck, following him around to the passenger side. "Just take me a minute to make room for you. Lots of gear and stuff in here." He mumbled mostly to himself as he worked, and she could tell he was a little flustered and a little shy about the whole affair. He was rearranging canvas bags and tripods, a thermos bottle, and paper sacks in the back of the pickup, were an old tan Samsonite suitcase and a guitar case, both dusty and battered, both tied to a spare tire with a piece of clothesline rope. The door of the truck swung shut, banging him in the rear as he mumbled and sorted and stuffed paper coffee cups and banana peels into a brown grocery bag that he had tossed into the truck box when he was finished. Finally, he removed a blue and white ice chest and put that in the back as well. In faded red paint on the green truck door was printed Kincaid Photography, Bellingham, Washington. "Okay, I think you can squeeze in there now." He held the door, closed it behind her, and then went around to the driver's side and with a peculiar, animal-like grace stepped in behind the wheel. He looked at her, just a quick glance, smiled slightly, and said, "Which way?" "Right," she motioned with her hand. He turned the key, and the out-of-tune engine ground to a start. Along the lane toward the road, bouncing, his long legs working the pedals automatically. Old Levi's running down over leather-laced, brown-filled boots that had seen lots of foot miles go by. He leaned over and reached into the glove compartment, his forearm accidentally brushing across her lower thigh. Looking half out the windshield and half into the compartment, he took out a business card and handed it to her. "Robert Kincaid, writer, photographer." His address was printed there, along with a phone number. "I'm out here on assignment for National Geographic," he said. "You familiar with the magazine?" "Yes," Francesca nodded, thinking, "isn't everybody?" "They're doing a piece on covered bridges of Madison County, Iowa. Apparently has some interesting ones. I've located 6 of them, but I guess there's at least one more, and it's supposed to be out in this direction." It's called Roseman Bridge," said Francesca, over the noise of the wind and tires and engine. Her voice sounded strange, as if it belonged to someone else, to a teenage girl leaning out of a window in Naples, looking far down city streets toward the trains, or out at the harbor and thinking of distant lovers yet to come. As she spoke, she watched the muscles in his forearm flex when he shifted gears. 2 knapsacks were beside her, The flap of one was closed, but the other was folded back, and she could see the silver-colored top and black back of a camera sticking out. The end of a film box, Kodachrome 2, 25-36 exposures, was taped to the camera back. Stuffed behind the packs was a tan vest with many pockets. Out of one pocket dangled a thin cord with a plunger on the end. Behind her feet were the two tripods. Let's see how much. Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm going to only read this as a great big long chapter, so. Oh wow. It's all about Francesca. It's way a lot of pages, so I'm going to read to the bottom of this next one, and then we will finish the rest of this chapter tomorrow night. Okay. Behind her feet were two tripods. They were badly scratched, but she could read part of the worn label on one, Gitzo. When he had opened the glove box, she noticed it was crammed with notebooks, maps, and pens, empty film canisters, loose change, and a carton of Camel cigarettes. "Turn right at the next corner," she said. That gave her an excuse to glance at the profile of Robert Kincaid. His skin was tanned and smooth and shiny with sweat. He had nice lips. For some reason, she had noticed that right away, and his nose was like that she had seen on Indian men during a vacation the family had taken out west when the children were young. He wasn't handsome, not in any conventional sense, nor was he homely. Those words didn't seem to apply to him, but there was something about him, something very old, something slightly battered by the years, not in his appearance, but in his eyes. On his left wrist was a complicated-looking watch with a brown sweat-stained leather band. A silver bracelet with some intricate scroll work clung to his right wrist. It needed a good rubbing with silver polish, she thought, and then chastised herself for being caught up in the trivia of small-town life she had silently rebelled against through the years. Robert Kincaid pulled a pack of cigarettes from his shirt pocket, shook one halfway out, and offered it to her. For the second time in 5 minutes, she surprised herself, and she took the cigarette. "What am I doing?" she thought. She had smoked years ago. He gave it up under the steady thump of criticism from Richard. He shook out another one, put it between his lips, and flicked a gold Zippo lighter into flame, holding it toward her while he kept his eyes on the road. She cupped her hands around the lighter to hold the wind in abeyance, and touched his hand to steady it against the bouncing of the truck. It took only an instant for her to light the cigarette, but that was long enough to feel the warmth of his hand and the tiny hairs along the back of it. She leaned back, and he swung the lighter toward his own cigarette, expertly forming his wind cup, taking his hands off the steering wheel for no more than a second. Francesca Johnson, farmer's wife, rested against the dusty truck seat, smoked the cigarette, and pointed. "There it is, just around the curve." Okay, I think we'll stop there.